From the WATE.com Digital Center, answering your legal questions, this is Ask Isaacs. Now, here's Lori Tucker and attorney Greg Isaacs.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Lyle and Erik Menendez. Are those names familiar? They certainly were 30 years ago and really through the years, Greg. And now we're hearing about them again.
We are. They're back in the news. Approximately 30 years ago, Lyle and Erik Menendez, who violently murdered their mother and father. Jose was an executive at RCA Records. These opulent, upper middle class young men allegedly in cold blood murdered their father and mother with a shotgun. And it was a trial that gripped the nation. It was one of the early bedrock cases for court TV.
It really was, and these were gruesome murders. The crime scene, there were pictures shown from the crime scene that were absolutely horrific. And in the first trial, because there were two trials, remember one ended in a mistrial, and let's talk about why and the evidence that was suppressed in the second trial.
It's very fascinating, and you know, it's interesting when you talk about how violent the crime scene was with a shotgun and the homicide took place at close range. You juxtapose that with what the conduct of the Menendez brothers was after they murdered their parents.
They
and
went
that
on
was
a spending spree.
A new Porsche, just Rolexes. Money was no object, and that optic didn't play well. But there's some legal issues other than the new evidence that may, after 3 decades, open this case up.
And we'll get to that evidence in a moment.
But when we go back, how did we get here? And legally, it's somewhat fascinating. The first trial that ended in a hung jury, the defense was allowed to put on, instead of the battered spouse defense, a sexual battered child defense. And their defense was that they killed their father based on the fact that they had been abused over a period of years. The jury heard that evidence. It was hotly contested, and there was a hung jury.
So as a defense attorney, they go back a second time and they keep all of that out.
This is what is really frustrating if you are a defense lawyer, and sometimes it happens to prosecutors, when the Court of Appeals changes the game after the fact. And you know, people wonder why lawyers make objections, because objections are important. Theories of the case are important. So fast forward, second trial, and there was a tremendous, it was like OJ, amount of public outcry against the judge, against the prosecutors. So this time it was done different. Two things that were significant that I don't think would be done today. They allowed, and this was a threat in both trials, a statement / confession by one of the boys' psychologists, Dr. Oziel. And because apparently one of the Menendezes said, shook his hand and said, "Have a good day," or "I'll see you later," the Court of Appeals ruled that that was a, quote, threat, which pierced the psychology of patient privilege and allowed that to come into evidence. Secondly, the big one was,
that's amazing to me.
In the second trial, they were not allowed to use the sexual abuse defense. They ruled that it was not analogous to the battered wife syndrome defense, and they had to go forward basically with their hands tied legally behind their back. So no defense, your psychologist's confession allowed into trial, and a conviction.
And there you go. I remember back 30 years ago when people were talking about this, and by and large, a lot of people did not believe that sexual abuse defense. They thought, oh, these kids, and mainly it was because they went on that spending spree and blew through all that money.
Well, and the other thing is they were a upper middle class, very attractive family, very active in their community.
Had every opportunity.
Right. And
Dad's
it
an
just,
executive.
And
yeah.
It just didn't seem like the type of home environment that behind closed doors, a high profile entertainment executive would be having sex with his sons.
But now we're hearing in that Netflix documentary and some other new evidence that's coming out, the DA in LA says, hey, we may be looking at this case again. In fact, let's listen to what he had to
What
say.
I want to make very clear, we have not conceded one way or the other. We're not saying that there was anything wrong with the original trial. We have been given evidence. We have been given a photocopy of a letter that allegedly was sent by one of the brothers to another family member talking about him being the victim of molestation.
All right, so what does that say to you, Greg?
Well, it says to me it's kind of interesting because Gil Garcetti, the DA at the time, he had his hands full. O.J. Simpson, the Menendez brother, and he was very public and very vitriolic that he was going to get the Menendez brothers. So fast forward, the man that's now sitting behind his desk seems to be somewhat swayed by the new evidence and the Netflix documentary.
And
so,
the family is coming forward too.
They are, and it's interesting because we've talked about why a cold case suddenly becomes hot and there's an interest, and that typically is you can rekindle media coverage, and with the Netflix documentary and the miniseries, that's what has happened here. Now, basically, they have exhausted all of their direct appeals. California, like Tennessee, you appeal to your Court of Appeals, your Supreme Court, then you can challenge under post-conviction whether your lawyer was effective. But those time frames have long ago passed the Menendez brothers.
So what could happen then? Why is he reviewing
If California is
this?
like Tennessee law, we have in most states what is known as a writ of quorum nobis, a Latin term that means it's kind of a pleading of last resort. But here's what you have to have. You have to show by clear and convincing evidence that there was newly discovered evidence or evidence that wasn't in the record. And in this case, it's the letter, which it amazes me that it took it 30 years to get into the hands of the prosecutors.
Because it was written 8 months before the deaths
Right.
of the Menendez parents.
By Erik, one of the Menendez brothers, to a cousin, detailing the abuse by the father, Jose. Secondly, what happened, and we see this all too often in high-profile cases, another individual has come forward saying that he was molested by Jose when he was a young man.
And this person, and it's been in published reports, you see him right there, he was a member of the former boy band Menudo. And he said when he was in that band at the age of 13, he was molested by Jose Menendez. So that's come out as well. And there are really graphic descriptions of what the Menendez brothers say happened to them at the hands of their father in the Netflix documentary. How powerful can that be in reopening this case?
Well, media coverage can be powerful, and it can be a sword or it can be a shield. In the retrial, media coverage was the Damocles sword for the Menendez brothers, because that publicity put the judge and the prosecutors under in the hot seat, under the spotlight, and everybody changed the rules of the game. Now, 3 decades later, the publicity is putting the DA in a position to be a hero. Look at all the attention he's garnered by saying, hey, there may be new evidence. These individuals could have been molested, so I'm going to do the right thing. So it's ironic. Publicity that was a catalyst in putting the Menendez boys behind bars may be the catalyst for them getting out. But if you look...
And I know where you're going to. Some cynics might say, what is his catalyst?
Well, that's true, but if you look at the Netflix documentary, it really, I thought, did a good job of going into the brothers and having them describe the abuse. And Jose allegedly, targeted the younger brother, and it was really very powerful when you heard how he was groomed and molested, and how his brother tried to be a protector
Over years.
over years. So,
Yeah.
this defense that was presented in the first trial, had some legs, had a lot going for it. But, you scratch your head legally and you wonder, when these people come forward after a jury verdict or now after decades, where were you at the time?
Correct. Speaking of that, we're going to hear now from the brother's aunt. This is their mother's sister, who says, I had no idea it was that bad. I thought that was interesting. Let's listen.
As details of Lyle and Erik's abuse came to light, it became clear that their actions, while tragic, were the desperate response of two boys trying to survive the unspeakable cruelty of their father. As their aunt, I had no idea of the extent of the abuse they suffered at the hands of my brother-in-law. None of us did. But looking back, I can see the fear and tension that their father had instilled on them. They were just children. Children who could have been protected and were instead brutalized in the most horrific ways.
If Lyle and Eric's trial happened today, the outcome would be drastically different. The evidence of their father's abuse would have been a central part of their defense. And it's very likely they would not have received such harsh sentences.
All right, that, of course, was their cousin. You saw attorney Mark Garagos behind her. This has gotten legs again, for sure. Talk about the power, if there is power in those statements. I mean, I found that the aunt was, it was poignant, and yet there were a couple of questions.
Well, the question that I have, I don't know if the evidence really changed or if society changed.
Right.
Because for her to say that we as a family didn't know about this and
Or didn't know the extent of it.
The extent and whatever. I mean, the Menendez brothers and their lawyers screamed it from counsel tables, screamed it from the witness stand, and that was their defense. And they were very clear and graphic during that first trial. You know, so now we have some revisionist history. So it's really amazing to me to see how media now has made it, being pro-Menendez brothers, a safer place to land if you're a family member, a more comfortable spot to garner publicity if you're the elected DA. So to me, really, the facts have not changed that would be presented in the courtroom, but I think society has changed, and people are now looking at the abuse under a different prism of reality and scrutiny, and it's more accepted. And we've seen how many, in the last 30 years, Lori, case after case after case, where people have come forward saying I'm abused. I think the Menendez brothers were maybe ahead of their time in doing that, but when I see her say, we had no idea, I'm like,
Where were you in trial one?
Where were you in trial one? That went on for weeks and weeks and weeks.
So let's talk about, before we wrap this up, let's talk about how tough it would be to use this evidence, this new evidence, the letter, the testimony from the former Menudo boy band member. Is that enough to get a new trial? Or is that enough to, you know, the family wants them exonerated?
Well,
you'd have to have a new trial, right?
Well, you know, it depends on if a trial court or someone found, like for example in Tennessee, writ of quorum nobis, then you could remand it for a new trial.
Right.
You know, the DA would have the authority to potentially modify the sentence. So, you know, that could be something that may be viable. But it's interesting to me when you look at the district attorney, and he's just not saying, hey, we get things all the time, we're going to review it in the ordinary course as we do. No, he has called a press conference to say we are seriously addressing this. So, you know, if you were just going to give it a cursory look, and this is very powerful, DA's office.
Well, and the pressure is on this DA's office.
Right, and again, they flipped the script because the pressure was to put them behind bars. Now the pressure is to let them out because now, 30 years later, Lori, my how times change. The victims now are Erik and Lyle Menendez, and Jose is now the villain.
So interesting. We, of course, will be watching. We'll talk more about this at 5:30 tonight on the air right here on 6 News. Thanks for being with us.